This talk is entitled, What is the True Science of Fire in Blood? And the subtitle of this lecture is Gold Powder and Alchemy and Implosion of the Blood. So, as we're looking at the pent geometry, the magnetic lines crossing that geometry, their electrical function is of interest. And as we were discussing earlier, how I believe that Nostradamus was able to see the future was because having learned to place his tower at the cross of pent magnetic lines, he was accomplishing two things. One, the electricity of the field around his scrying water was phase conjugate and therefore implosive, and that means that the phase velocities of the electric field coming to that water were superluminal, and that is by definition how you penetrate time. So in effect, he was sucking the time, the waves of charge through the speed of light called time. Backing up, time is the name for the period of rotating charge, just the way mass is a name for the inertia of that rotating charge. So the period of rotating charge, when you achieve phase lock, is the definition of synchronicity, for example, which is why golden mean ratio defines how time emerges from chaos. Remember yesterday we showed the wavelength of hydrogen was golden ratio times Planck. So Planck is fractal in time and space, and also the Planck time constant times golden ratio accurately predicts the solar year and the Venus year. So we have lots of proof that fractality is the only way time emerges from chaos, because obviously that's how waves of charge converge, which is how the New Age people say all time came into the present. What they mean is the electric field, the charge, is able to converge superluminally because that's how you penetrate time. That's how the future and the past come to the present, is when you rotate faster than the speed of light. You can think of yourself as being here before we got here next year. It's all done in circles. At any rate, so there is Nostradamus, and he is scrying water. Now he's in a phase conjugate dielectric field, the pent lines. And the second quality we discussed today was clearly he was weeping for those whom he saw. And if you understand a bit about the physics of compassion, the electric field that causes the heart to fire, we've done this so many times, most of you have seen us do this lecture, but we have, I won't dig up the computer graphics, but the electric field that causes the heart to fire is the fibers of Purkinje, which are fractal, and that is a toroidal field, actually. So your heart is literally turning inside out recursively. I'm turning myself inside out for you, darling. Well, when you're feeling compassion, you're embedding, which is to say, you're imploding. And it's getting so late, I'm not very good at digging up pictures. But, here it is. This is the physics' best view of the source of voltage which causes the heart to fire, which is a donut turning inside out recursively. And we know that during compassion, empathy, and love, in fact, the number of harmonics in the power spectrum creates what's called ascension. And so that is sucking here. This is literally electrical suction. Your heart is dimpling and turning inside out. And that implosive process can suck in phase velocities faster than the speed of light. It means, for example, that you might begin to understand why the person who steered the dodecahedral time travel antenna at Montauk, called Deca Delta, was called the time empath. The one who was able to embed in the path, which is literally to feel for. So the fact that Nostradamus was weeping for those whom he saw was a big part of the physics of his ability to see them. In the sense that he was literally sucking the future to him by feeling compassion, because that is the nature of what's happening in the core of DNA. And that's the subject of tonight's lecture, which is the physics of how fire is ignited in blood. So, at the core of DNA, the core of blood, you have this implosive electric field, which Jung called the collective unconscious, and Jesus Christ called, the body of Christ. And this is an electric field that is gathered where waves can agree. And that physics is called fractal and phase conjugate, obviously, and it's well known to be self-organizing. So how you become part of that electric field is the physics of how you ignite fire in blood, kind of the scientist's answer to "Come on, baby, light my fire." And "Come on, baby, light my fire" in this case is those magnetic lines crossing in that pentacle. And so the little story that goes with this starts with a myth. And the myth is, there was a family of angels called the seraphim. Sera meant serrate, or to be cut by phi, which is what happens in DNA if the braid is fractal recursive and in soul. And that became the seraphic font, which is a cookie cutter, a flame letter. And the seraphim family's public relations agent in this myth, the guy named Raphael, narrates their genetic propaganda to Mary, and that becomes Christianity. And the same guy, Raphael, narrates his genetic propaganda to a guy named Muhammad, and that becomes Muslim. And the same Raphael narrates the propaganda to a guy named Joseph Smith, and that becomes the Mormons. So it might be of interest to know what was the genetic agenda. And the genetic agenda is a mistake based on the false idea that DNA that changes is defective. And so this requires us to then to ask the question, well, what is the true way in which DNA is ignited on fire in such a way that your blood could then bend the light, bend magnetism? Because if you can bend one magnetic line, then ultimately you can steer a star. So it would be useful to understand how blood is ignited in the sense of "Come on, baby, light my fire," which is the physics of bliss, obviously, which we talked about last night. So the history of this, we tell a fairy tale to make the history fun, that the seraphim had some cousins in the family whom they were very sad had a genetic disaster. And these cousins lost the ability to ignite their blood with fire. And that fall was called Nephilim. And this lineage became called Anunnaki, or in the sense of Uru, as in Nibi Uru, or Hebrew, or Jerusalem, Uru Asa Elam. The Uru in Europe, Ural, and Roman, Uruan. The Uru means of the ancient dragon blood, and this refers to this ancestry back through the Nephilim to the seraphim. The high-winged dragons being the seraphim, and the falling dragons being the Uru, Anunnaki. And in this story from Alpha Draconis, who was the pole star at the time of the pyramid, and Alpha Draconis' stars were Thuban, Thiuba, which became the word Yahweh, and Arrakis we know is there. And we know the shadow of Alpha Draconis is the Arabic letter El, as in Elohim, and that's actually the geometry of the stars. And so in this culture, the genetic disaster was the loss of the scientific skill to how to ignite fire in blood, in the sense that, as we announced in Italy, that you do not have culture unless you can teach your children how to have bliss, ultimately. So it isn't the coffee and the wine and the tobacco that defines culture. No, culture is defined by your ability to teach your children to have a bliss process, because obviously that's the only thing that makes them and you immortal, because it's the only thing that builds aura, which is what you take with you when you die. So in that period, originally that culture, the queens were called the Mag, as in Migdal or Magdala, matrix of Agni, which referred to the geometry of implosion in their blood, their DNA. And the Mag culture, the queens were called Asa from Uru, from which we get the word Asa, Uru, or Din Asa, Uru, dinosaur, or Asuras. And the queens of that culture were highly telepathic, and it was a feminine-dominated culture in this story, which we also believe Atlantis was. And in that culture, they used a technology for igniting the glands of their children, which was to feed the women's menstrual blood, called oil of Messe, and they were dragon, you could think of as reptilian, and the oil of Messe was a form of crocodile juice from which we get our word Messiah. And the women's menstrual blood that had enough melatonin and serotonin was also called the starfire. And if a baby was fed this, which served the function of royal jelly, there'd be an explosion of growth in the high glands, like my fire. But the ability to supply this menstrual blood that had enough melatonin and serotonin depended upon whether the women had access to bliss, the Vestal Virgin culture, as it were. And in that culture, critical to the genetic disaster was when there was no longer a bliss process. As we know, when indigenous peoples lose their bliss ritual, they get AIDS, because the immune system is not nourished. And that was true in that time as well. The culture began to live in metal structures, and their DNA could no longer absorb charge, and they lost access to bliss. And we sort of are doing a bit of Groundhog Day now on that one, and that's why we're telling the story. So they had to resort to a substitute, and this is now the subtitle of this lecture, Gold Powder, Alchemy, and Fire in the Blood. In that culture, they had a ritual which I believe is called Baphomet, related to what Vincent talked about the head. But he was talking about the head of the idea. I'm talking about the head, the skull touching. The bone touch of the queen, Asa Uru Baphomet, would convey the plasma of hundreds of generations of tribal memory, and the new queen could absorb. An example of the ignorance of that is reflected in today's beehive culture, where the bees are dying because the beekeepers don't understand that you can't just kill the queen, because the queen's DNA represents the fractal of the memory of the immune system of the hive. So the continuity of the queen's memory is critical to long-term survival, something today's beekeepers are ignorant of. And the genetics of this culture, and you can think of them related to Merové, the bees, was related to this physics of how to keep fire in blood. At any rate, at the time when they could no longer convey their memory in bone because they didn't have access to that bliss, they then resulted to a substitute, which was a quartz crystal skull and a quartz crystal technology. And if you know anything about quartz technology, the memory in quartz, the symmetry is hex, and it's opposite to implosive, and so the memory is literally frozen. And that's what really killed. So the quartz technology was actually the death of the seraphim, the Asa Uru culture, not the birth. And when they began storing their memories in quartz, that's when they died. It was, as we say, the astral hygiene disaster. And correlate to that fall was their addiction to this. And you can feel it if you like. This is gold powder. This is the real thing. And I warn you, it can burn your aura. And I would put it in the gold cup, but when you do that, it even gets worse. But they found, this is instructive, that's why the subtitle of this lecture is Gold Powder, Alchemy, and Fire and Blood. The physics of alchemy and gold powder is related in that if you looked at the DF completed orbital, which is gold, palladium, platinum, the platinum group metals, which is key to the projective powder and the philosopher's stone, that the outer symmetry of the electron shell of gold is precisely this, making it noble. But the other thing that this precise golden ratio 3D fractal Grail geometry does to the gold, palladium, platinum atom is invites infinite charge collapse. So a gold atom in the presence of the right capacitor, and this was the capacitor they used, it was called the Ark of the Covenant, but there's a spark here, which is phase conjugate, implosive, electrically, and this is an electric generator for making the voltage necessary for gold powder manufacture, which supposedly was the chief cottage industry, the cash cow of the Essenes, which they learned from Moses, apparently Akhenaten. who was clearly a gold powder cook. And so in the ancestry of this culture, the ancestry of the royal family of the Egyptians called Ptah, Hatal, which is the high order genetic behind Enki and his part of that family. We're talking about the descendants of the seraphim. And so they learned how to make gold powder. If you take the gold atom and you put it in that capacitor, it turns inside out like popcorn, changes from yellow to white, changes mass, and it starts to float like the unobtainium in Avatar. And it becomes soluble in water and blood, and if you eat it, you live forever. But there's a minor detail on this, as we say, the fine print on the medicine bottle that said, may cost you your soul. And that had to do with the fact that there was an addiction to the gold powder consumption, which is essential to the ancestors of our family. And I disagree with Vincent, by the way, who says that he thinks it's a shame to teach that we were gold mining slaves, because actually the song "Looking for a Heart of Gold and Growing Old" is actually something of a privilege. But that's sort of another story. But the point we want to make here is the science. And the science is that the reason the gold atom turned inside out was because charge could collapse in this way, which is the real physics of alchemy, access to a black hole. And that's why when you ate that white powder, which later became Holy Communion, was served in a round white wafer, the DNA would receive that electric field implosively. So it was very quick for the DNA to absorb that charge, radiance, the very physics of the word heaven and the word plains of Sharon was that electric field. So your blood was going, ooh, highly addictive. But the thing is, if you didn't do the work to make that electric field yourself, that is kind of the definition of addiction. And so you can see it's a bit of a long story. We're doing just a brief summary tonight. But later, as actually Vincent, he did get one thing right when he was talking about his explanation of why mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years. It was because of the gold powder content. And I had thought that that culture, the Egyptians, were gold powder addicted. But Vincent said that the way of mummification was a way of turning the blood and actually the flesh into gold powder. And talk about how blood is turned into fire, star fire, how you ignite the fire in blood. The slow cook in the bandage of the mummy had a trace mineral in it that Vincent identified as natron, which is a slow version of what was in the meteor, the glass meteor, which was later called the Kaaba of the Muslims, which Kelly ground up to be the philosopher's stone, the key to their alchemy for gold powder making. And later, the Templars learned to vaporize gold into glass for the red glass manufacture, which is psychoactive. So you see how these things all relate in that the ability to know how human plasma is imploded, ignited, put on fire, means that the charge density of the core of biology itself becomes so great, it's like holding lightning, and which is really an introduction to Kundalini. And again, I'm going rather fast here, a few minutes, getting late, but you see the essential principle, which is igniting fire in blood. When that skill, which is basically a skill to teach your children how to have bliss, when that's lost, the resulting turn to addiction was actually the catastrophe of a whole gene pool, the Nephilim story. So if we essentially recover the correct physics of how bliss, ecstasy, and enlightenment happen, and it is electric field related, then we could avoid this genetic catastrophe in the future. Which is why I spend a good part of my life on the physics of how bliss, ecstasy, and enlightenment is measured. And we discussed this last night. Some of us weren't here, but the power spectrum of EEG indicating the onset when your body makes this electric field, golden ratio in brain waves, and your aura gets measurably fractal, you're imploding. And your blood absorbs that charge, and the DNA braids recursively, as we explained graphically, and receives the power spectrum of the bliss moment. And your ability to implode can be done two ways. It can be done externally, eating a little gold powder, or it can be done internally when you make that electric field from inside out. And that's the difference between addiction and self-empowerment. And so you see this essential science, that Dragon Uru culture knew to find the places where blood is ignited. What Vincent is revealing is just one minor local example. In a million years, these pentagonal patterns on planet Earth are going to be boring. But the physics of how you get blood ignited so that the electric core of blood is actually gravity-making and star-bending, that's going to last. So I'm not saying, again, history is boring, but I'm saying the pure physics transcends the history. And the physics is, if you know how to ignite fire in blood, you have the power. And that power isn't something that's about ego. That is literally the blood telling you, you have located a wave that's shareable. And therefore, it's literally not possible to do that in a selfish way. Because the DNA itself is only connecting waves, collecting waves that serve collective survival. Yes?
So when you experience an intense moment of compassion for someone else, that's a shareable...
That's right. But it's interesting, when they say you only fall in love with pure intention, only love bends the light, therefore only love creates. What they effectively mean is that you can only identify with a shareable wave. So if you're unfortunate enough to fall in love with a square aluminum building, your body probably will not gain plasma. So as you become more discriminating about what you fall in love with, your plasma growth is faster.
So falling in love with this place increases your plasma growth?
Probably, I would actually. And actually, falling in love with the pictures you've been showing us of the pentacle was a good thing. It's to say that you're choosing to embed in a wave which is shareable and therefore immortal, where a shareable wave is precisely defined as coherence perfected in fractality. So, come on baby, light my fire takes on a new meaning, right? It actually means, do we have the skill to teach the hygiene for bliss? Now, our 4-day course, which I'm off to teach in Italy, ends with one full day on what is that hygiene. And that day says, well, let's see, you're going to need 50 to 80% raw food, live enzyme. You stop eating angry DNA. You do the yoga. And you learn to always place your body in a place where it can absorb charge. So every time you're walking into a room or being anywhere, you're planning your day in such a way that your body will not be placed in environments that are less than fractal, because they don't permit your aura to breathe or you to absorb charge. So the ability to seek to develop a charge-absorbing lifestyle is basically the beginning of getting your plasma big enough to be a star and take memory through death. So, yes?
What are mobile phones doing to it?
They're pretty much nasty bad poison, particularly if you hold your mobile phone near your head. But, if you're dumb enough to be playing with those microwaves near your body,
The wireless technology is the same as well.
They're strong and weak Wi-Fi. The weaker Wi-Fi in some countries is not quite so bad, but it's better to use an Ethernet cable, actually, probably true. But the microwave technology in the mobile phone is much worse. It's true. Actually, as Drat showed, you can measure human bliss in the microwave. And the bandwidth, unfortunately, was not reserved and should have been. It has to with the wavelength, the quantum distance to adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And that actually is a broad spectrum RF by which you can scan for human bliss, truly.
Then can the expression of pure intent through compassion and love trump some of the other hygiene factors?
The joke was sometimes you walk on water and sometimes you take a bridge. But yes, you can cheat a few times. But generally, a lifestyle of addiction will never produce a large aura, in my opinion, actually. And it's only a large aura that's ultimately going to get you there. And, you know, whoever has the most shareable thought gets the big aura, so it's not selfish. You know, really, it's true. Your ability to accrete plasma is biology telling you that you are a shareable wave. It's what's meant by pulling the sword from the stone. Effectively, the stone is the mountain, and the sword is the living plasma in that mountain that comes to whoever has the most shareable emotion, because the waves in that mountain know that you will make that plasma immortal.
I guess I'm saying if you work in a metal building and, you know, some of those factors, you don't change, but you're actually working from a place of, you know, pure intent.
Yes, no, and I'm sure you can take a lot of love into a really poisonous office building a few times, but I think if you spend a whole career there, it's going to be pretty tough to keep fire in your eyes. That's just a guess,
Yeah.
really. Yeah. I mean, the idea is that every time you feel a shareable thought, a pure intention, your hair stands up. So electrically, you simply attracted living plasma. And that living plasma is the Jedi of the Jedi, you know. And the thing is, the physics of that, the microfluidians in blood, or the boson 7, is actually the physics of how DNA absorbs human bliss. We know all of that science so well now. It's about time we made it shareable.
So how does the ego affect that?
You know, in the perverse Western psychology, ego is considered evil, when in fact opposite is the case. If you identify properly with how plasma becomes the sun, then you indeed recognize that you are supposed to be a sun god. And you identify with that. That's called a big ego. And you know exactly what it is to be a sun. You have to learn how to grow up DNA on all these planets. You're going to need a lot of compassion. So in fact, you identify with a very large plasma field, just like becoming an Ophanim angel. So in that model, a large ego is good, which is probably why Lucifer got bad press, you know. You too can be God. Lucifer was right.
But can your ego be like good? You're giving sunlight to everyone as opposed to you burning it. You know?
Which is to say, if you get very good at knowing what serves the survival of all living plasma, all biological memory, if you can identify that, you would only always be thinking a shareable thought, and therefore you would only always be attracting charge.
I think it's possible to see ego in a slightly different way. It may be that you wish to, and I'm trying to find some words to make this clear, you may realise that you are, as you say, part of a larger being or sentient entity such as the sun, and the ego doesn't attach to that unless you attach to the outcome of that, or some other outcome. So it's the attachment to the outcome that brings the ego in and screws it.
Well, but actually, I mean, once you know what the Ophanim are trying to tell you, you need to become interstellar plasma because they need you.
Yeah.
And that's not false ego, that's appropriate.
Yeah.
That's why stars went to so much trouble to grow in.
That isn't ego. That's attachment. That's
It's
realising an outcome without attachment.
Again, you don't need a psychobabble when you have physics.
Okay.
Really. The physics is that
Just use physics babble.
that
Works just as well.
no, that you have a pure language of precise symmetry, which is how you embed in plasma. And that's all that physics is that symmetry. It is not babble. And so the Ophanim are saying to you, look, stars didn't go to so much trouble to make DNA for no reason. No, DNA makes the centripetal force that holds the sun together, and we can measure it. So the Ophanim need us, the interstellar plasma needs us to make that centripetal force. We did this whole little shtick about about the natron and the,
I heard you.
yeah.
So you
And
have
so
the power.
at some point, Vincent, it'd be lovely if Vincent wanted to tell more of that story, but it's getting late now, but about how the mummification actually turned the flesh to gold powder, and what that means in terms of plasma. It's
Late.
It's late. So unless there's more questions or comments, here's to fire in your blood.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.